Welcome to the Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Subchakchai Bankard, and I'm so fortunate today to have my two favorite Star Wars friends with me, and we're celebrating May the 4th, which I guess if you don't know, people say May the 4th be with you, and that's why it has become Star Wars Day. So with me I have Ion Cannon himself, Greg Cass.
Hello there. Committing to a visual gag on a non-visual medium, I am in full cosplay, which I thought we should all be doing, but I guess I'm the only one.
I didn't get that memo, Greg. I would have done it. And I also have the Ben Quadernos of podcasting, PT McDiff.
Long Take reviewers are stronger together. Happy to be here. I don't think I can emphasize enough the panache with which Greg pretended like his camera. He didn't know how to get the camera to work in the lead up to the reveal that he is in fact gone full Kenobi.
Let it never be said I don't commit to unimportant bits.
I have to admit, I was totally taken in by that. I really thought that you didn't. I'm like, wow, Greg still hasn't turned his camera on. I assumed it was like you're having a bad hair day and you didn't want to tell us. That's why you were like pretending not to know how it was working. But this is way better. All right, so we're gonna break down our little Star Wars party here in two parts. First, we're going to talk about Return of the Jedi because it just came out. It was re-released in theaters in honor of its 40th anniversary. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then we're going to shift over to sort of generally the future of Star Wars movies and talk about specifically the Mandoverse. So, you know, how the Disney Plus series are potentially feeding into future films. So, but before we even do that, we'll do a really, really quick movie news check-in. I was originally going to skip this, but there was some big news that broke yesterday. The WGA, the Writers Guild, is now on strike. Has anyone been keeping up with this news?
I mean, I'm aware that they are on strike. I know some people whom this is affecting, and I don't know if that was the right whom. I'm very nervous now because I've got two people here who know how to critique me on grammar. But yeah, the vote happened. They are on strike. It's seems mostly sort of geared about streamers and the royalties or lack thereof coming from work done for streaming services. Unclear how long this is going to be. I haven't really seen or heard any estimates about like, oh, this is only going to be a week. It'll be fine. So I don't know what the outcome is. Probably not going to affect many movies, imminently, like, because obviously those are written and filmed and in post-production. But any movie that might have reshoots on deck, and obviously any movie that's going into production or currently in production, could be affected by this. We could get a lot of Quantum of Solace type poorly constructed set pieces over the next 2.5 years because of the strike.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's going well. So the little reading and listening I've done on this, it sounds like, as you said, a lot of the problems that they're trying to address are largely, it seems like it's affecting more TV writers than movie writers. And it's due to the shift to streaming and that just like seasons of television have gotten so much smaller. Like instead of a 24 episode season, a show would have like 8 to 10 episodes. In some cases, we've definitely seen that with the Star Wars series. This and especially Marvel, like we've gotten 6 episode seasons in some cases, and so that apparently has really affected the size of writers' rooms and kind of like there are a lot of issues with compensation around that. And it sounds like that the streaming they're basically digging their heels in and not agreeing to anything. The podcast I was listening to Pop Culture Confidential this morning, and they were interviewing Tom O'Brien, who shows up on Next Best Picture and Gold Derby sometimes, and he is a part of the WGA, and he was saying that they've only agreed to have meetings, and they have not agreed to to any of the requests, and they have not counter offered anything. So that to me, I think we're in for a long haul. And so yeah, I second what PT says in terms of how the ripple effect that this is going to have on the film and television industry.
I was thinking a lot about the last writer's strike, which was happening in the middle of like when I was a really heavy TV watcher and I was watching even like a lot of late night shows, which, you know, those were kind of the first to fall because there were no monologue writers all of a sudden. Um, and just how, like, I think the fact that my watching habits have changed so much is exactly why they deserve more money, right? That the old models for how they were compensated just don't fit anymore with the way people are streaming content and the way revenue is built. So, you know, so far I've just mainly seen a lot of the kind of splashy celebrity posts about I stand with them, and you know, we're talking Star Wars today, so I saw even Charles Soule, who's one of the big writers who does the novels. He is a member of WGA East, and he said, you know, he's on strike, his pencil's down. So, you know, I am not smart enough to know if that means, you know, if he's working on comics and novels, is he doing that work but ignoring the work he should be doing to consult on a TV show or what have you? But it's going to be interesting to see, I think, to the point both of you made, like when we actually see these effects, because I'm not feeling it probably this month, but you know, a year from now when there's a bunch of movies that clearly needed another pass at the script, maybe that's when we'll start to feel it acutely.
Yeah, I think there was a news article that popped up on my feed the other day that was like, because so many studios are like rushing to put out articles being like, this is finished, like to kind of reassure people that like, oh, some of your favorite shows are still happening, right? This doesn't mean that things are shutting down. And I think one of the comments in response, because I think it was about House of the Dragon, like House of the Dragon, the scripts have all been finished or something like that. And someone was like, yeah, because first drafts are always the best ones or something. Like there was some snarky comment about like, yeah, because things don't need rewrites ever. So yeah, that's yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see. And, you know, again, to bring it back to Star Wars before we move on, I think for me, and I think all of us are pro writing in some varying capacities. We are all teachers of writing and you know, writers ourselves. And writing often makes a huge difference in terms of if something, like in terms of really elevating something or making it work. And oftentimes if something is not working, you can kind of point to the screenplay. And, you know, when we were talking about Andor, I feel like that was a huge part of the conversation, right? That the Tony Gilroy factor, right? And that he was so powerful with the writing. Anyway, yeah. So we talked so much of the conversation about how wonderful Andor was really rooted in the writing and those beautiful monologues and everything like that. So I like, it's a real shame that this is happening. And I hope it resolves in a way that the writers are happy with.
Yeah. Go writers, solidarity with them. I hope they get all that they deserve in a good way.
Yeah, it's like the word deserve there.
Yeah, that sounded meaner than it
meant. Okay, so now we can move on to you know, happier news. Return of the Jedi was in theaters. We got to see it. So I want to start with kind of going into this screening. Had you seen Return of the Jedi on the big screen before? What was kind of your relationship to the film within the Star Wars franchise? What were your kind of expectations going in?
Well, I'll say I believe, and it's hard because I saw two movies very close to each other. I think Return of the Jedi is the first movie I ever saw in a theater. Either sometime in 1983, I would have been 5 years old, or I would have been 4 when the movie came out and then turned 5 right after. And I saw that and a re-release of E.T. like that summer, where those were like one. So yeah, it's deep in my core as a movie going, being dedicated to the theatrical experience, as we discussed last time. It's right there. It's at the foundation. And yeah, I've seen it, you know, a few times since then. Some revival screenings, you know, in like high school era, and then the special editions came out. And I actually saw a 30th anniversary screening here in LA with Mark Hamill doing a Q&A beforehand, which was incredible, obviously. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's Return of the Jedi. I love it. I love that movie.
Greg, how about you?
I had definitely seen it in 97, and I saw it this weekend with a buddy, and we were both debating whether we had seen it ever projected theatrically besides that. And the consensus we came to is that we'd been to an Empire screening at Celebration Orlando the year Last Jedi came out. Was that the 2016 or so, 2017 probably. But hadn't seen Return of the Jedi, so I don't think I had seen it in the theater since the special edition. I'm a baby compared to old man McNiff here, so I was not around to see it in 1983. I was born in 1983, so I'm turning 40 with Return of the Jedi this year. And so it was a real treat in 97. And, I think I was like a seventh grader. So it felt like they'd released it because I had suddenly become interested in Star Wars. And so, we'll put them back in theaters for you, young man. And then to see it again this weekend was a real treat. It's really funny to me, the discourse around the OT. I feel like now you have to say Empire is your best, you're the best one, your favorite one, or else you're kicked out of Star Wars Club in some ways. I used to always say that I thought Empire was the best film, but that Return of the Jedi was my favorite. And I think that was my way of kind of sneaking around, like, I know what I'm supposed to say, but I really like this. So, recency bias, what have you, but I had such a great time at Return of the Jedi. I think it does stand as probably my personal favorite of the OT, even if it's the lesser film in some ways than perhaps what the others mean to pop culture.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I am probably the worst, which tracks with my history. I'm the worst at seeing movies in theaters again, because I have, until this past weekend when we went to go see it, I had never seen this film on a big screen. I'd only watched, probably my VHS tapes when I was younger, and then in various digital forms. So although I have to say, before Force Awakens came out, I think there was a screening at my husband's work that was, but so someone basically was like projecting the despecialized editions from their laptop. So I don't know if that counts. But it was a bigger screen than I had seen it before. And in general, yeah, I love this film. It's interesting. I've kind of been on a journey with it where it used to, if you asked me when I was really young, it was my favorite. I would say that it was my favorite Star Wars movie, mostly because I think for me, Star Wars is at its best when it's being weird and cute. And that might be because I have an extensive collection of plushies and I love the creatures and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like this movie really delivers on that more than, or the most, in the original trilogy. But as I got older, Empire definitely kind of started to appeal to me more because it's a little darker, it's a little edgier. There's more cinematically, I think, probably to appreciate. And so yeah, I like your solution, Greg, of saying one is your personal favorite and the other one is the best one. But yeah, I also had a great time watching this in the theater. I thought it really was a special thing. Yeah. So let's tell me a little bit about, how did you see this in the theater? What were the circumstances?
I got out of work early on Friday. I got out at 2:00, and I had gotten permission from my wife to be a total deadbeat parent and just left for the day. And so I went two in a row. So I went to the 4:15, grabbed Shake Shack, and grabbed the 7:15 showing. 4:15 I actually went by myself, and then 7:15 a friend joined me. And it was fantastic, and I really enjoyed going there. I assumed they were just playing the latest version of them, which was confirmed once it started to roll, and you could kind of piece together which changes were there and all that. But I had a hyped crowd, and so I was worried about a little cynicism. I actually was holding my breath for when Hayden appeared, if he would get booed or something like that. But the crowd was into it. There were cheers when the Lucasfilm logo appeared. Not quite as rambunctious as, at Celebration, Zuckuss appears in Empire Strikes Back and the Zuckuss heads are going crazy and shouting for him. But so it wasn't quite that much, but the crowd was definitely into it. A surprising number of college and high school kids at the 4:00 showing, which, I didn't know if they would go see a 40-year-old movie, but it clearly meant enough to them. There was a couple behind me that a couple dude bros, college age, that were talking about how, well, Thor: Love and Thunder is the worst movie I've ever seen, except for the new Star Wars movies. Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, then why are you here? And this is, before it began, but then we're totally into it and cheered along. So whatever kind of got them there and over their hurdle, it was a good time, and I had a great time seeing it.
Well, PT and I actually got to see it together. So that was extra cool. We went, PT and Jasmine were gracious enough to drive all the way down to the theater that's 10 minutes from my house. To make it super convenient for me. So I really appreciated that. It made it so I was neglecting my family a little bit less in total, which is always good. But yeah, I think we saw it. It wasn't a packed theater, but it wasn't empty either. It was, it was decently. There were empty seats, but it wasn't,
and this was on Sunday, right? Because mine was
Yes.
Friday. So
yeah, we were Sunday, and it was midday. It was like a 12:30 screening, so that might have been also why it wasn't as full.
It was more people than I expected Sunday at lunchtime.
Yeah.
It was robust.
Yeah, and we also had a lot of tweens and teenagers in our screening.
There was it was like, clapping and cheers for like the 20th Century Fox fanfare, and for a long time ago, and there was like a burst of applause at the opening note of the fanfare. And people were into it. There was laughter at like the jokes, but there wasn't that sort of what can sometimes in my mind feel a little like performative, where it's just like, yes, that's Han Solo. And now we all know that's Han Solo. And which I'm into, and like if you're in that zone. But sometimes it can feel forced.
We had that when we went to go see Empire Strikes Back in concert.
Yes.
It was like literally every time any character came on screen, people were like, woo! And it's like, okay, like let's just watch the movie, okay? But yeah, and I think our screening, people cheered for Hayden.
Nice.
At ours. It wasn't like a raucous cheer, but it was like a hey kind of. Mm-hmm. So that was really interesting. PT, did you want to share the sort of damper on your experience, which Me Too seats over did not encounter?
I mean, and in retrospect, it was more cute than not. But there was to our right, there was a young child, I would say like 8 to 10 years old, and his presumed dad, a male guardian who had brought him to the movie, who I can only assume has no idea what is happening, and does not want to have any idea really. And like there was just a lot of chatter because it felt like the kid was translating in from English to a language I could not identify, because they were trying to whisper, but like sort of like explaining what was happening and what was being said to the adult, who was dutifully listening, and then taking out his phone and then just like playing on his phone for like sections of the movie, which in reality was annoying in my peripheral vision and my peripheral audio sphere, hearing sort of and then like seeing the screen pop up, but once sort of time passed and I wasn't like, these people need to stop it, it was kind of cute that like this kid was super into it and really excited, and was trying to like lure in the same way that I'm sure like when I was 8 or 10 and I was explaining like, and then in this book, like this is what happens to Luke Skywalker, to my parents, who are like, yeah, these movies are enjoyable trash, like I'm glad that you enjoyed them, whatever. And it was so it was sort of adorable, even though like right when the movie ended, I feel like Jen was like, that was great, and I was like, these people wouldn't be quiet, and so that was my bad on like the immediate post movie energy.
Yeah, I was in the end of the aisle, so I was just in my own little world with our large popcorn that I was spilling everywhere as I was eating it because I was trying to share it poorly, and I was great. Were there things during this watch that you paid attention to, or you noticed that maybe you hadn't on previous ones?
I mean, I'm going to steal an answer that you said in person, but it was true for me as well. I was really on the edges of the frames, to be like, oh, look at all the creatures, look at all these action figures I've overpaid for, to have on my shelf, for the Jabba display. Like, yeah, that guy really is in there. And so I was really looking at, on the things that it's harder to not as it can sort of harder to see on a TV, but also like I'm usually so locked in on what's actually happening in the scene that it's it's hard to pay attention. So I use the big screen to do that. And the sort of, I guess, one thing that hit me this time that doesn't, which is small, but since you asked, is I really felt this time the sort of arc of once the battle starts on Endor, and the Ewoks are going after the Imperials, how much the sequence is the Ewoks like trying to figure out what is it that like stops these things, that they're like, okay, I'm gonna like throw something at this walker, that doesn't do anything, okay, I'm gonna hit its foot, okay, that doesn't do anything, and then eventually getting to the like, oh, the logs need to like smush its face, or we have to roll logs to like trip it. And it just it for some reason, seeing it in the theater felt more like that was a kind of deliberate trial and error development, of the Ewoks, kind of like, okay, let's try this. Nope, that failed. Okay, how about this other thing? Okay, nope, that didn't work. Oh, this is working. Like let's do more of this. Which potentially undercut some of that old school 80s criticism of like, it doesn't make sense that the teddy bears beat the big thing. It's like, well, I know, but it's like Ewoks stronger together, like they're working and figuring out what to do. So I don't know, that really the rhythm of that scene really played, of those elements of the scene, I thought played really well.
Yeah, and I think as you're describing that, I'm like, would that scene happen in a movie now, a big budget action movie now, like a Marvel movie or something? You know what I mean? Like, would we get the multiple tries? I feel like the answer is no, which is too bad. And like, that's one of the things that I kind of thought about as I was watching this, is that it really takes the time to build in quieter moments and kind of reaction shots and take a beat. Like, even if it's like the camera holding on Vader's face as he like tilts his head, right? Or like the Rancor keeper crying after after Luke slays or beats the Rancor, right? It's like little touches like that kind of build both character moments and kind of evens out the pacing, right? Where we're just not just go, 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 which I feel like a lot of current franchise films have that issue where it's just they're all full steam ahead for 3 hours and you're just like, I'm exhausted. And so I thought, yeah, that was the thing I noticed more this time around, kind of comparing it to movies that we get now. How about you, Greg?
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple things you were just talking about. I think that pacing thing generally is to its strength, but I will say, especially the second time in one afternoon, that middle section really drags. And I always remember this because I would put on the VHS that I'm sure was taped off HBO, and that's where I'd fall asleep. If it's like 9 o'clock at night, I'm starting the movie, I'd just zonk out somewhere in that middle section and wake up to the blast of the end credits. And so it definitely is like a slow part of that movie, kind of from when they leave Tatooine through the Yoda scene, through the through a couple of the kind of meeting up and then getting there. And it really doesn't pick up again until after the revelation between Luke and Leia there in the middle. So it is an interesting pacing thing. So I also spent a lot of time on the edges of the screen, particularly in Jabba's palace. And there was one shot that really impressed me that had never stood out before, which is it is when the droids arrive and we are back in the alcoves and the camera pans across two openings and Reese is behind the column and he kind of shifts his body as the camera passes him by. And I was like, that's just a really cool shot and to put you deep into those creatures. But that starts with Yak Face and Jay Quill and pans across Reese. There was also an extra who primarily played an Ishi Tib, who was like acting his or her heart out when after the Rancor dies, they cut back upstairs and there's this Ishi Tib just like gesturing wildly, like, I can't believe this happened. Like it cracked me up, and it was so great to see. I actually played an Ishi Tib in our first Star Wars RPG, so I've always had a soft spot for that species. But then the last one that is not something either of you said that I'll point out is sometime on a recent home viewership, I caught the rebel trooper who is most famous now because people say it's Rex.
Right.
And it is very confusing because about halfway through the battle, when the raiding party gets brought out of the bunker, he's suddenly in scout trooper armor. And there's no explanation for why there's a scout trooper in the kind of crowd of people being held captive before the Ewoks come. And in this viewing, you can actually see him. I noticed for the first time, what they do is that Han Solo taps the guy on the shoulder and they run around the edge. And then the next shot, as the raiding party enters the bunker, you see him standing and putting on the gear, which I had never seen before until this. I used to watch it on pan and scan full screen, so I'm sure he's not even there on that version. So you can kind of see this whole little narrative where like, oh, okay, there was one guy standing out front. So if the troopers come back, we need one guy standing out front. They dress this older trooper in it. And then when, the full garrison comes, they arrest him along the rest. So that was like one of my favorite little pieces to watch. It's very much the flavor of Rats Tyrell in the Phantom Menace, how there's a whole narrative happening on the edges of the pod race scene. So it felt like George doing his old tricks.
Yeah, and I feel like the world building in this one is so great because I was a while back I was on the Wampa's Lair podcast, and while that is a stain on my podcasting record because of Wedgegate, where I conflated Wedge, Antilles, and Biggs, which I will never live down, and is a forever shame for me. But we were doing our top 5 favorite minor characters. And it was so hard for me not to just pick all of them from the Return of the Jedi. And like, we just and I think both of our lists probably like really leaned a lot on Return of the Jedi, like Salacious Crumb, Max Rebo. Admiral Akbar is my all-time favorite minor character. And, this is his movie. And so like, I was the only one in our theater who was like, yeah, when he says it's a trap. So
I felt like there was some Akbar appreciation when he first appeared. When they're they're going into the Home One briefing and they cut to him and the one or two other Mon Calamaris, there was a little ripple of energy. Maybe that was internal and I externalized it. But I feel like there was some Akbar love in the room.
Well, and Carl from Wampa's Lair, who I saw it with, and he and I both pointed at the screen for the Mon Cal that misses the monitor. Do you know this guy?
Oh yeah.
The extra turns around and is supposed to have his flippers on the monitor, and he's just touching the wall, and then the extra catches on and moves over and then starts touching the screen. It's very funny. It's the Return of the Jedi version of the stormtrooper bumping his head, essentially.
I still really like Mon Mothma's facial expression while she's listening to Akbar deliver the like plan, where she just like really looks like he might as well be describing some sort of genocide. Like she looks so horrified. It's like very distracting.
Her delivery of the many Bothans died is still like, that's one of my favorite weird vibe moments in any of those original movies. Something I want to say that like I was reminded of watching it this time is, and I think this speaks to what both of you were saying earlier about like what's the best versus what's the favorite. That like, I don't know if I ever was like, well, Return of the Jedi is my favorite because I did always love Empire Strikes Back before it was cool.
Sure.
And also, and again, maybe this is the like, I'm speaking with children who are 5 or so years younger than me that like, by the time I was catching on, I don't know. But like that, when it was sort of like, I just need a hit of some Star Wars. I need like 30, like I need a TV episode length of Star Wars. The opening Jabba's through the destruction of the sail barge, that was the one episode of Star Wars television that existed. When it was just like, I'm just going to do like a quick something, which is crazy because now we have, whatever, like 80 hours of, between animated and live action of TV that we could watch if we need a fix. But yeah, that opening sequence is incredible.
I want to shout out my favorite shot in the movie. Got me so amped up both times. So it's as the fleet is massing, there's this tracking shot of the Falcon swinging through the fleet, and the model goes away from the camera, and then something passes at the front of the screen, and then it's roaring back across kind of there, and you get to see all the starfighters and all that, and it's just, it looks so beautiful on a giant screen, and with really good sound. I mean, the sound is also, I forget when I watch something on my TV at home, I'm like, yes, the picture quality, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, no, but to see it with real sound instead of my crappy little TV speakers is a real benefit, and just wonderful. All the little bits of dialogue I caught, I'm like, oh, that's what they said there, instead of mumble, mumble, mumble. So it was a great moment. And that shot has this roar of the Falcon engine, and it's really exciting.
To shout out my favorite shot, which also benefited from it's a great point, the sort of theatrical sound quality, is in the duel, the final duel, when they move out from underneath the Emperor's platform, and the camera like pans past the stairs, and Luke is snapped, and he's going after Vader, and the Emperor's theme is just like really like that low rumble choral is like building, that sort of mixture of the music, which is obviously so crucial to Star Wars succeeding, plus the sound effects of the lightsabers, plus the camera work, which is generally not flashy, but like Richard Marquand does do a few like Greg mentioned earlier in Jabba's Palace. There's some really great tracking shot moments that he does, or maybe Lucas did, because I know he sort of oversaw the more actiony things. But whatever, like that shot, like that's a goosebumps moment when I'm just thinking about it. But seeing it in the theater is just like full chills, and especially the character moment where it's like this is the precipice of when Luke could fall. Which is something else that hit, like watching it this time, was thinking about what would this be like seeing it for the first time in a theater, which again, I don't recall. I was too young to actually remember my feelings, but the movie, it does clearly sort of set up Luke could go to the dark side, Han Solo could die. And, in retrospect, we know, and it's like in our bones what happens, that those things don't happen, but like, the pieces are all there for those two potential bad outcomes to happen. And, I think the movie is pretty successful at like getting you to believe it, even when you kind of know, but this is the end of the trilogy. They're not going to do that, right?
I'd say the thing that took me by surprise during this viewing was how gripped I still was by the final scenes with the Emperor, Vader, and Luke. And just like, because I've seen it so many times, but the fact that I was still kind of like you said, like hanging on the edge of my seat, being like, oh, like what is like, what is going to happen, even though I know what's going to happen. And just like the writing in that scene is it's pretty unadorned, but it is so good because it really just drills down to the core themes of Luke still seeing the good in his father and not willing to give up on that, and in the end that's sort of what helps him pull through, and then in the end that's what makes Vader finally come back to the light side, right? That he sees, because it's really when he sees the Emperor hurting Luke, right, that he kind of makes that turn and says like, no, I'm not gonna stand by while this is happening. And so yeah, it's pretty simple in storytelling, but it's so powerful. And I remember, that just took me by surprise that I was still sort of in that headspace when watching it for the umpteenth time.
It's funny how like the nose, which felt like a deep like problem when they were introduced, like all those little changes don't matter to me anymore. Like they kind of all blend together. Yeah, some of the old CG doesn't quite age as nicely as the practical effects or what have you, but it's funny that, in the wrapped up emotion of that scene, it's like, yeah, I don't really care whether he talks or not. It's about the emotion and what the character just went through, and just, yeah, I'm in it. I'm in that moment. It made me also, they're releasing that Lego set, and I was like, I gotta get that Lego set now.
It always comes back to the merch.
I will disagree slightly in that those things do still bother me, and that's it doesn't take me out of the moment, but I do long for the like, just give me the like actual 83 version of this. There's very few times that I get the like dig in my heels, throw a tantrum of like, this is not my Star Wars. But one of them is one of the later era movies, which maybe we'll be discussing, the last one to come out in the theaters. I just whatever. And these special edition changes, I don't know. I don't like it. I don't like. If you're gonna have Hayden be the Force Ghost, then Ewan McGregor should be Obi-Wan. That's all I'll say.
Two things, listeners. I got the full version of this lecture after we came out of the theater when I was like, oh, I actually had forgotten about the whole ending being different. Because last time I saw the movie maybe was was a despecialized edition or something like that. But I didn't remember the montage of the different planets at all. This was like, I was like, what? Like, what are we doing? And I forgot that there was no Yub Nub, and then I got really sad because I really like that song. But then the other thing was, you can't see this, listeners, but PT is actively like repressing all of his feelings. I can see it in his face.
It's fine. I'm also regretting that like the narrative of us seeing it was just me coming out with like anger and negative energy between the other people in the theater and the changes to the movie, which I didn't mean for that. I had a great time and I loved it. I think I think it is hard that this is part of an inherent problem of fandom, is when you're just like, I loved everything about that movie except for, and then like the except for is something that feels more interesting to talk about when whatever. Like, I'm glad we're mostly talking about all the things we love. That is better.
Well, and I will put my nerd position on the record that being said, while those things don't matter to me deeply as much anymore, I do think it's kind of a crime against cinema history that they don't have the originals available anywhere. Like, yeah. I also, like, somebody on 70 millimeter pointed this out this week because they were doing A New Hope. It's like, put the 3 on a disc, charge $100 for that disc, and you will have a mint, like all the money. Nobody's not going to pay whatever you want to pay for those. So I do think it's kind of crazy just that those versions aren't available. There was somebody in my theater who definitely wasn't expecting the Gungans to show up in that final montage, and he gave a big, not necessarily angry, but like a what? Like a shock and disbelief. And it is, I agree with the song as well, that like there's something charming about Yub Nub. Yeah, it's super cheesy, but I think it works a little better than the kind of pan flute finale with a weird drum beat put into it just so they can still use the Ewok on the helmets that matches the other song. But
yeah, I feel like the Ewoks are such a critical part of the story, especially in the last act, that like taking away their victory song seems like a disservice to them. It's like undervaluing their contribution to the rebellion.
I was gonna say, I was also gonna note, and again, this is not to dwell on negatives per se, but Jasmine, my girlfriend, who is been sucked into learning about Star Wars in a way that she never would have ever wanted to, she's always sort of been just like, these are movies I see like once, and that's fine. And so I don't, has watched Return of the Jedi, I think probably twice since we've been together, but this is obviously the first time in the theater, and so she has a sort of a babe's innocence of like what is the thing, and she was just sort of like, does it seem weird? And this was she honestly had no idea like what door she was opening. It's like, does it seem weird that like what like all like the end of this movie was like erased by like what happened after that, like the Mandalorian and then like the other movies, that like they never really won anything, and it was just sort of like, oh, you've like tapped into like a deep level of like fan angst about the sort of direction of the overall narrative in the post Lucas Disney era of the sequels and the Mandoverse. So yeah, Jen and I were very good at like responding to that in a short enough amount of time that we could have conversations about real life during lunch after, when it really threatened for the whole meal to go off the rails.
Shout out to Jasmine, who at Star Wars Celebration, I think at the big Lucasfilm Live panel, ended up sitting next to me, turning into a like raving lunatic with excitement, and just had to witness that, and yet continued to speak to me like I was still a normal human being. So she's obviously a champ in that regard.
Or she has experience of living with someone who does the same thing all the time.
Yeah. She's completely unfazed by anything like that, I think. All right. So that was actually a perfect segue, because my next question was going to be, how does this film sort of interact with the rest of Star Wars canon now? Because in both directions, right? Like, are there things that we now have story-wise that kind of recontextualize things from this film, and vice versa? Like, how does this film kind of like cast any sort of story context onto things that we've gotten more recently?
It feels very small and quaint compared to some of the like big crazy things that we've gotten lately. So I'll lead off the discussion with just an old version of this, not that recent. But I confessed to Carl as we were walking out, whenever I see Darth Vader, I don't think of Hayden Christensen in there to this day. Like, that's not to undermine the prequels or the performance. I know I'm also wading into dangerous waters, but I will say, just in my head, those are different characters. And as much work as they've done over the years, including the Kenobi show, to merge those, I'm just always like, yep, that's Darth Vader. Like, that's not Anakin inside there. And even at this movie, I love the ending of that story and the way they reunite, and, you know, let me look on you with my own eyes, and all that stuff really is wonderful. But I'm not in my head going like, that's the guy I hung out with in the Clone Wars. Like, it just doesn't do that for me, even though I love all those bits of his character arc.
I actually have never like consciously thought about how I feel the exact same way. Of just sort of like, yes, well, Darth Vader is Darth Vader. And I know that Anakin Skywalker becomes Darth Vader, but that's just like young Darth Vader. To the degree I link them, it's just sort of like, yeah, this is the guy who becomes the character that, you know, I do when I was 5 years old, which I think that's part of it, is that like we had these before we had the other stuff for so long, and it like seared into our being. I also agree with you that it does sort of seem quaint. I remember feeling back in the day that Death Star 2 battle above Endor was like the biggest, craziest thing, and now we have Rogue One, and even some of the fights in this the ship-to-ship battles in the season of The Mandalorian seem almost comparably complex and blown up and large as this thing does. So it does sort of feel small. I also, watching it this time, it made me sort of think about how much, I don't know, like benefit of the doubt or grace, like fandom in general should extend to some of the new Star Wars things, even when we're like, I don't know what's happening here. Because again, I don't know why, somewhere in the back of my mind, maybe just being in the theater, I was sort of like processing this as like, what was this like to watch in 1983? What was this like to watch when like you only knew the first two movies, and if you knew them really well, this came out? And, you know, the sort of pivot with Luke to being like, you know what, like actually Darth Vader can be saved. Like, does like if you were going to approach it in the way that like, you know, someone who hosts a YouTube channel might watch a new episode of or new installment of Star Wars, they might be like, well, where does that come from? Like, he just sort of starts saying it to Obi-Wan, and then he says it to Leia, and then he's suddenly like, no, like, you're good. And it's just like, what evidence of that have we had? Like, no groundwork, blah, blah, blah. And similarly, the like, and actually you have a sister, and actually it's Leia, and actually we've all known that. Like, didn't we all know that all along? And, you know, that part of that is a behind the scenes reality of there was going to be, you know, when they were initially putting together Return of the Jedi, there was going to be 4 more movies instead of 1. And there was going to be another trilogy that was hunt down the Emperor and find Luke's sister off in another side of the galaxy and reunite and train and blah, blah, blah. And then for various reasons, George was like, I don't want to do all that. We're just putting it all into one movie. And it all kind of got condensed, and suddenly Luke and Leia is a sister. And that's, again, the way it's always been. And we're used to it. And we've seen them be born together. And we've now seen them both as played by young child actors. So, you know, we're very prepared for that. But, in the moment, it does, you know, sort of feel like crammed in a way that I think, again, if it were today, people would, be rioting in the streets about like bad storytelling. They didn't plan this. They didn't prepare the story, blah, blah, blah. And so, what if we just let that wash over us and see if we can just experience like happiness and joy from it the way that most of us do from Return of the Jedi. Which is, I don't want to say don't be critical and don't, raise concerns and questions, but it's also sometimes good to just kind of pretend we're 5 again and let it just be, and see if we can enjoy it on its level.
I thought of that at a very, very micro level many times. Perhaps the first one is the droids jump off the sail barge, and then there's like a little magnetic grapple that picks them up, and then the droids are just magically on the deck. And it's like the things we see could not do that at all. And I had that exact same thought. I'm like, if this were in The Last Jedi, there would be like outrage in the streets and flipped cars because absolutely can't work. It makes no sense. And it's like, it doesn't matter. And the other version of that is when the gang gets captured and are taken to the Ewok village. There's this shot of them carrying C-3PO in his chair. I forget what the name of that kind of chair is.
It's like a throne chair, right?
Yeah. And they get right to the edge where an Ewok very clearly swings on a rope. And it's like, yeah, that chair's not going anywhere. Like, that's the end of that story. Like, they just have to stop there. But nobody cares. It's like, yeah, whatever. Like, it's just setting up the world and it's giving you a little, fun. And it is, I think you're right. There's a place to be critical. I think, all of us would say be critical of filmmaking, be critical of the writing. But we could also be a little more generous and say like, hey, let's just enjoy these little details and not worry about the logistics of how exactly C-3PO is standing on the deck in the next shot or what have you.
You're both making me realize that maybe Star Wars has had an even bigger influence on the way that I watch movies than I thought, because in general, I'm not the kind of moviegoer who tries to pick apart the logic of anything. I'm ready to go for the ride most of the time. Like, I'm just, with the occasional exception. And I'm just, it's easy to suspend my disbelief. I'm just going to go with it. If you're telling me, like, I'll believe you. And so I feel like maybe that comes from my love of Star Wars, that like, that has trained me to just enjoy what I'm getting and kind of like trust the storytellers that they're going to take us on a fun adventure. Sorry, my cat is trying to join our recording. Wampa, we're not talking about Empire. You got to come back. That's really interesting. To go back a couple points to what you were talking about with Darth Vader versus Anakin, I feel like I don't know if how intentional this was, and obviously it wasn't intentional because there was no way for the creators of this film to know what would come in the future. But I feel like it's built into the story through Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? It's the certain point of view thing of like, to me, they are two different people, right? Like that, to me, one died when Anakin turned to the dark side, and then Darth Vader was born. And so I feel like that's really convenient from a storytelling perspective in terms of franchise storytelling, because there's a built-in sort of like philosophical separation between the two that makes it easier to sort of be like, oh, like they are two different characters and yet they are on one continuum. So that I think works well. And then actually, like, as you're talking, I'm thinking back, I know there was a lot of debate about Obi-Wan Kenobi and the series and how it kind of retrofitted the original trilogy, because it kind of had to be like, had to maintain continuity. But I feel like when I was watching Return of the Jedi this time in the theater, the conversation between Luke and Leia, where he says, "Do you remember your mother?" and her answer just means so much more now to me, because it, like, in a way that is better, like makes sense, where she's like, like at the time, if I had seen it in a theater in 1983, I don't know if I really would have thought, having no knowledge of the prequels, no knowledge of the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, I don't think I really would have, it would have registered as very meaningful as a phrase, right? I would have just been like, oh, okay, like that's what she thought. Or there's a story behind there, but I don't know what it is. But now that we do know what the story is, I feel like it carries so much more weight. So I really like that there's sort of like an interplay retroactively.
To be the person that goes in, and I know this has been said but many times, so I'm not going to belabor it, to nitpick some of the connections, and this is the sort of about, I guess, the making of the prequels more than about, you know, this movie itself. But the lines that sort of are like, huh, like just a little bit after the prequels came out. One is from that Obi-Wan scene when he's just like, well, I thought I could train him as good as Yoda, and I was wrong. Which, like, I've always really liked Alec Guinness's delivery of that. Like, I don't know, whenever I'm wrong about something, that's in my head. I'm just like, I was wrong. But then it's just like, is that what happened? Like, he went through, like, I mean, there is that sort of like, I'm going to train him. And it's like, well, Yoda doesn't agree, but the council does. And it's like, okay, like, I guess. But that feels a little bit like, you know, in the same way that you can watch Star Wars, aka A New Hope, and be like, what does this world seem like? Or what do the events of the world seem like if you try to erase every other movie that came out? It feels a little bit different. You know, it sort of feels like Obi-Wan was like secretly doing it without anyone else knowing and then screwed up. So that's an interesting sort of contrast. And then that Leia line where it's like, well, what is your real mother like? You remember your real mother? She's like, only like shadows, images. I was very young when she died. And it's like, yeah, we've seen it. You were like 40 seconds old. You were incredibly young. Like Luke was only like 5 seconds younger than you. So like that doesn't fully match up, but there's something in there about like, well, she could sense Padme with the Force. Like you can headcanon that away. But I think that, you know, when all this is to say, I think when we talk about like, how does Obi-Wan Kenobi, the show, like twist, you know, trying to like manipulate itself to fit in, and does it fit, and blah blah blah. The prequels had to do the same thing, and George was just like, who cares, like it's fine. Because he's George Lucas and he can do that. And I think that everyone extended him, I shouldn't say everyone, certainly not everyone, many of us extended him more, you know, a little bit more grace to be like, yeah, this is your story, dude, like you do whatever you want. Which maybe, you know, he's earned more than the people who have taken the reins over. But I think that especially maybe for any folks out there who are prequel kids, who are, you know, pro prequels and are just like, I only believe in the 6 movies of the saga. It's like, you had to do the same thing, like with the prequels, to have them fit with the original movies, as you have to do with anything that's come out since to fit with those 6 Anakin saga movies.
Ghost Obi-Wan having to sit down is another one of those little things that I was like, why you can project yourself through time and space, but you have to sit once you do so because you're tired. It doesn't really work and would be the source of a YouTube video. Jen, I'll let you take it. I was going to start talking about sequel trilogy, so maybe you have another point related to the prequels first.
No, I was just going to say we're kind of moving into, I mean, I was going to go Mandoverse, but we can do sequel trilogy then Mandoverse. I just feel like we're naturally segueing into the second half of our conversation about sort of like the where the franchise is going, and kind of like how all of, since we have so much Star Wars now, how is it all holding together? So yeah, take your point.
Yeah. Well, so I had a good friend who really, really disliked the sequel trilogy before it was cool to dislike the sequel trilogy. And so when Last Jedi came out, they were freaking out and so on. But one of the complaints that was made frequently to me was like, well, then Return of the Jedi doesn't mean anything if the New Republic falls. And I think that does fit in now with how we're thinking about the New Republic in light of the new season of Mando, which I think changed a lot of people's impressions of it. And the kind of reasoning I always gave is like, you know, World War I ended and that was important. And yes, the resulting peace directly contributed to World War II. And yet we still would celebrate the fact that we ended the First World War. And then, yeah, World War II happened. And I still think that kind of nerd argument logic largely holds for the larger galactic, you know, the silly Ultron line of, or no, it's Vision of, you know, a thing isn't beautiful because it lasts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the attempt to reach peace and to end tyranny mattered. And yeah, maybe it only worked for 30 years, but hey, that's 30 years where we weren't killing each other all the time. Although maybe we were learning we were doing worse things to each other during that time. So I will say that for me personally, up through Last Jedi totally works for me and all that. I have more trouble applying that logic to the fact that Palpatine is out there and all his real power is hitting on another planet. And this probably is mainly rooted in my love of Last Jedi and my skepticism of a Rise of Skywalker. But I do think if we're thinking about kind of how these later things impact Return of the Jedi, we can't ignore the fact that, like, okay, so he didn't die and none of that mattered, although he also had like a billion Star Destroyers on ice somehow. And so I'll stop. But I think it is a harder pill for me to swallow in some regards after now seeing the full sequel trilogy.
Yeah, I will say I fully agree with everything you're saying. I actually thought, even though there was some degree when the Force Awakens was out, when it was just sort of like, is this like too hard a reset? Which, you know, there's obviously meta reasons for that, of like, people didn't like the prequels. Let's do essentially get everyone back to first position. So we remember A New Hope. Like, what if we kind of did A New Hope again? And, you know, it was great and everyone loved it. And it was great. You know, there was all kinds of, there were enough changes and blah, blah, blah. But there was that feeling. I mean, opening night, one of my friend Rob was just sort of like, is it a problem that they didn't win? Like, the end of Return of the Jedi, like, is no longer like a victory. I think that World War I, World War II comparison is apt and strong. That, you know, peace isn't forever. Peace isn't inevitable. It's, you know, there's always not a problem, or feels like there's a problem of like, there's not as much time as you think in between each trilogy of the three trilogies in the Star Wars movies. But, you know, things move fast sometimes. I will say, watching Return of the Jedi again in the theater only underscored that I was like, Palpatine just should have died here. Like, this is the death of Palpatine. I can't believe that that this was a choice that was made. But again, I'm treading close into like not my Star Wars territory, so I won't belabor it.
So to segue us from somehow Palpatine returned to we're cloning with the Mandalorian. There I think I did it. You know, I really wanted to focus in on, since we just finished season 3 of The Mandalorian, and at Star Wars Celebration, Kathleen Kennedy announced that 3 new films, and one of them is a film by Dave Filoni that will, according to StarWars.com, focus on the New Republic, right? So very, very much tied into what we've been talking about right now, and close out the interconnected stories told in The Mandalorian, The Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, and other Disney Plus series. So I think, you know, from the film side, we are heading towards this event film, it sounds like, with all of these series. And so my question kind of is like, what do we think that means for the larger franchise? So like, what impact is that going to have on Star Wars as a larger story universe? And is Star Wars going to become too much like the MCU?
I will say, you know, the Marvelization or the Marvelification of Star Wars is something that I think has been just, you know, speculated since they were like, and here's all these shows, and we're gonna do all these movies, and there is you know, the long list of movies that were announced or heavily rumored that haven't made it. I think it's up in the double digits at this point in the Disney era, if you count trilogies at least.
You put a Wikipedia article in our Google Doc.
Yeah, it's right? There's a lot, and this is only ones that sort of were officially, I think, like officially spoken of in terms of an announcement. You know, it doesn't include the Josh Trank Boba Fett movie. It doesn't. I don't think. Yeah, this list doesn't include the Zack Snyder Seven Samurai movie that has become Rebel Moon, not the non-branded, the Kirkland Star Wars that's coming out on Netflix. But yeah, you know, there's been a sort of lot of stops and starts, and it there's been a sort of worry or at least observation that you know, that could be like, well, Marvel's been really successful, maybe Star Wars wants to copy that, which I think is sometimes rooted in or is certainly fueled by this idea of like, well, now Star Wars is not owned by its creator George Lucas, but it's owned by Disney, an evil corporation that's big and blah blah blah, and so it's going to do the same thing that like Marvel did. But I think that that was fear mongering. But now that like Marvel has had some stumbles, or at least there's been some sort of more negative reaction from even the sort of, I think, people who are really into the MCU. It starts to be like, well, is this even a good model? All that said, Star Wars is like based on old movie serials where it's like, here are little like episodic stories. The idea of like, here's a bunch of stories that are all going to grow and be interconnected and lead up to one big finale doesn't seem like it's not part of that heritage and not part of that sort of legacy of where it's coming from. So I don't think it's a bad idea to sort of build up to a movie, especially when there's a degree of, well, when is Star Wars getting back into the theaters, which is, it's kind of funny that it's like, it's been 4 years. Like, we haven't had a movie. And it's just sort of like, oh, child, let me tell you. But yeah, I think it's something to be wary of. And I think we can get into a discussion of, is it affecting the storytelling choices of the series as they exist? But I think as a concept of like how this is going to end, or at least sort of this era of the Mandoverse will wrap up, I'm excited for it.
And I think there's a piece in what you just said that makes me think a lot about the way just knowing that changes all fan perceptions. And I don't disagree that Marvel is in a bit of a stumble right now, but I think what struck me as somebody, we were just bragging about before we got on air, that Jen and I saw Iron Man early at a preview screening 15 years ago. And so I've been there from the beginning, before the rest of you. But there was this weird thing that happened around the pandemic where everybody was stuck at home and they're like, now's the time to tackle the MCU. And so there was this big surge in, at least the way I perceive it, in fandom for it. And then because the expectation was everything matters, everything counts, Marvel really stumbled because it's like, no, here's Shang-Chi, and sure, it's in the same universe, but it's kind of its own thing. Isn't this cool? And people are like, no, Black Widow, no, like, it's got to connect. And if you're not advancing the master narrative, then your entry is meaningless. And of course, this is hyperbolic, but that's roughly what I heard from a lot of people. And so I think Star Wars is in for trouble if everything becomes, it's advancing one big story and we have to do that. Now, I'm saying that as somebody who reads all the novels, all the comics, absolutely everything related to Star Wars I consume. But at the same time, it's like, I do that for fun. I don't do that for the hidden secret pieces that are going to unlock the season 3 finale of Boba Fett for me early or something like that. And so I think they're going to have to train Star Wars fans on how to consume some of this and what the expectation should be. To continue the Marvel comparison, I will say I thought this season of Mandalorian made me much more nervous for the MCU-ification of Star Wars than previously, because it felt to me like it was having the same problems phase 2 of the MCU had, where it was suddenly like, no, here's Thor 2 and you should care. And you're like, this is really bad. Like, I don't know. And so this effort to kind of connect it made the actual core of what is Mandalorian weaker. So my personal take on this season of Mandalorian is, when it was focused on Din and Grogu, great. When it started trying to pull in all these other strands, it just lost its way and was not as sure-footed about what it is. And I think what Star Wars has done in the last 5 years or so is, when they're not sure, they go back to fan service. Mm-hmm. Whoa, sorry. Yeah, we didn't mean to get rid of Grogu. He's coming back. Yay, here he is. Be happy about that. And again, this isn't hate on Rise of Skywalker, but that was a lot of it. Like, whoa, did Last Jedi challenge you and make you rethink what heroism is in the modern age? We're so sorry. Here's your guy. Like, don't worry about it. Everything will be as you expect it. And so I do think that, in my opinion, Star Wars' problem is it needs to stop listening to fans. And as a fan talking on the internet as we speak, stop listening to us and just be bold and hire creative storytellers and let them do what they want, and don't rein them in and maybe that list of people's projects that don't end up coming to fruition will shorten, right? Because they'll want to stick around and they'll want to see it get all the way there. So I'm a little nervous, if I'm being honest, about this big project, if that's all Star Wars is. But, the fact that they came out and said it's this and it's James Mangold doing something really wacky 25,000 years ago and some love for, the new Jedi Order or something new. I'm sleeping easy because it's those three things and not this one thing.
Right. They're not putting all their chips into one bag. That's not a metaphor. Or wait, there is eggs in basket. Eggs in
a basket. Yeah.
Yes, they're putting all their.
So you mean
putting
on fruit in one starship? I don't know, something Star Wars.
No, you really make a good point, because I feel like there are two competing meta narratives, and we just heard that coming out of Celebration, right? The idea that all of these things are going to converge and come together, but then we also have been hearing we're going to be dabbling, and we've seen this with Marvel as well, I think, and not as successful probably as it's been so far with Star Wars. The idea of we're going to hire a bunch of creative talent that people who have their own style and their own personality, and we're going to give each piece of this puzzle to them. With Marvel, I think that largely hasn't worked out, because it's there's not enough of the personality. And I think Taika Waititi probably would fall under this, that everyone loved him putting his stamp on Thor Ragnarok, but then Thor Love and Thunder, not so much, right? And or people oftentimes get swallowed up in the story continuity machine. They have to stick to the brand and not kind of make their own choices. So it's this weird in between space. And so I feel like we're hearing the same thing with Star Wars potentially, of the Acolyte sounds tonally like a super unique thing that's dealing with genres that we haven't really seen in Star Wars before, right? Skeleton Crew, I think a lot of the way that a lot of the log lines for these shows are picking and choosing different genres, right? And it's not about kind of everything being the same and everything being contiguous. Like Skeleton Crew is supposed to be basically an Amblin movie from the 80s in space, right? So and so, yeah, I feel like the question becomes, can those two things coexist, right? Can you have your cake and eat it too? Can you both have sort of the creative freedom to let your talent kind of do their own thing and experiment and take risks creatively, but then also serve, like Greg's saying, serve this larger story that the fans are demanding, right? That everything has to fit together, everything has to be advancing and working together. I'm so tired of hearing podcasts complain about what we don't know where the MCU is going, demanding that we have some sort of very transparent master plan of we don't have a clear trajectory for where these movies are all going to go as one big story. So yeah, I hope that they that Star Wars tries to balance that in a way that's healthy. But yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the what both of you are saying, the sort of lorification of fandom is it's not great, or at least I feel like it's not a healthy way to try to experience stories. I remember reading, and I feel like I want to be it was this great scholar, but I'm it was a Twitter thread I read once from someone with a cartoon avatar and a weird name that I don't recall. But it was what different kinds of fandom do different things, and that there's a sort of a one way to approach being a fan is cataloging, and it's just sort of well, here's everything that happens, and I know the name of every alien that's in Jabba's palace, and I know every new episode or every new movie of the MCU or of Star Wars is just sort of immediately just kind of I look at the credits, I know this guy is this is this person's name, and this is what sort of alien it is, and blah blah blah, and it's just I know all these things and I memorize it, and that's a way to sort of be that's how I'm a fan. And there's other sort of generative fandom, which is I make fan art and I cosplay and I whatever it might be, and that some of that sort of falls along sort of gender lines and racial lines, where it's sort of how represented were you, especially talking about Star Wars, it was the straight white guys were just sort of yes, I know everything and I learned all the things, because they're represented in the stories very clearly and voluminously. I didn't say that right, but that's fine. And then other people were like, well, I got to make my own versions of the stories to fill it out. So I think that, this sort of pivot to like, what's the lore and how does it add the lore and how does it advance the lore, and watching things to just expand Wikipedia entries is not healthy and doesn't seem like a very productive way of thinking about it. So that's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say about all this, I agree that I'm more excited about the idea of Dave Filoni directing a live action Mandoverse finale movie, because it's not the only thing that's happening in Star Wars. But I will again harken back to talking to innocent babe in the woods, Jasmine, about like her experience with Star Wars. When we first started dating was like the fall that The Last Jedi came out, and I was like, hey, I'm going to see this movie at least 3 times the first weekend. Do you want to go at least one time? And she was like, yeah, I guess. I just really didn't like the last movie. Like, I just didn't like it. And I was like, oh, like, you mean Rogue One? And she was like, yeah, I don't know why they recast the girl and then killed her. And so like, she didn't understand that like Rogue One didn't star Rey with a new actress, and then she died at the end. Because, and that's partly because like, she probably wasn't paying super close attention. But I think that we, as like deep in all of this fans, are very comfortable with the idea of like, yes, you're going to do 3 movies. One of them is going to be way far in the past, and one of them is going to be the end of the Mandoverse, and one of them is going to be after the sequels. I wondered the degree to which regular people are going to be like, what the hell is happening? Like, what is going on? And, I there's all sort of speculation about why is it that people didn't go and see Solo, about the timing, about the backlash, about just not wanting to see that character played by someone else, about the quality of the movie. But I think that part of it could have been more casual fans, blockbuster movie fans who are not necessarily locked in, just being like, what? Like, but Han Solo died? Like, what's happening? And, kind of just sort of floating away. So I am curious if this plan will work, where, the MCU is generally pretty linear. I know there's been a couple of, Captain Marvel was in the 90s, and Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2, sort of volume 2 of Guardians of the Galaxy stayed right where the first movie happened, even though time's gone by. But mostly those are linear if they're sort of disparate in genre, disparate in characters. It's you can kind of follow along pretty easily. Whereas that's not how Star Wars has been handled ever, really.
Yeah.
I do want to talk about Mandalorian season 3. So I'll pick up on a thread from what you just said, what Greg said earlier, of like, now this season makes us more nervous sort of for the sort of larger event based, everything ties together storytelling that it seems like we're going to get. We're a couple weeks out from the finale of season 3. Have your feelings about it changed? Like, what is the retrospective of 2 weeks sort of afforded you, either positively or negatively?
Hey, Visions is coming out tomorrow. Oh, wait. I do need some legitimate thoughts on it. I'm just going to be deadly honest, because what is the long take known for except its honesty? I just haven't thought about it. Mando has never been like a core part of my fandom. I don't dislike it at all, but it's not something I watch over and over again every season. And it's kind of like, yeah, it's a thing that happened. I like not waking up at 5 a.m. Isn't that Star Wars fandom where it's like, it's fine. I have to be up at 5 a.m. to watch it, but it's fine. But that's kind of where I was. It's like, I enjoyed it. I consumed it. I critiqued it. I did all those things. And then it's like, haven't really thought about it. And I think that's partially because for me, each season of Mando has been diminishing returns for me personally, that I thought it was really interesting and cool when it was so different and doing its own thing. And as it's increasingly doing the same thing every other Star Wars does, I found it less compelling. And, in particular, I thought the writing this season was really weak. And there's speculation online that that's because Dave Filoni was less involved this time around. And maybe that could be true. But I'm not even talking big lore stuff. I'm talking about an episode where you establish that jetpacks only go so far, and then 2 episodes later somebody flies to space in one with one. Like, I want whatever. I just want like internal consistency on whatever these stupid made up rules are. So I had a lot of trouble with Mando, and as such, you know, I think my fandom, there's been a lot of Star Wars books out lately. I think I just kind of moved on. Jedi Survivor is out, which is phenomenal. So I'm just moving on, which I don't know what that says, if anything, to larger trends in fandom.
Now, Greg, I don't believe that those ships were in space. They were in low orbit, in atmosphere. I don't know if that's true, but I do think that, anyway, I agree with the critique of the writing. I have always I think I've liked Mando more than you. Like, this is sort of tapping into that Western vibe, is something that, like, the scum and villainy side resonates with me. And so I've been kind of locked in on Mando. That said, I agree that there's, you know, much more. I have concerns, and especially concerns with the sort of just the storytelling, the sort of narrative foundation of this season, and what it might mean for going forward. I also feel a little differently in that, to me, like, the second season of Mando is like my favorite of the ones that existed. And I think that I don't want to fall again into the trap that I think the sort of the easy ecumenical critique of the sequels is just like, it just feels like they didn't have a plan, which I don't think is accurate, and that's maybe another conversation for another day. But I also am very like, for me, The Last Jedi made The Force Awakens a much better movie. Like, seeing The Last Jedi, I was like, oh, okay, like, this pick the ball up and move forward. And then the problem is then, as Greg mentioned earlier, that The Rise of Skywalker felt like, oh, okay, wait, you know, you didn't like that? All right, wait. And, you know, that if you go and read or listen to the podcast version, audio drama version of the Colin Trevorrow script, which would have made one of the weakest Star Wars movies we've had, it at least connects in with, like, the other movies in a way that feels like, no, they had a conversation. This was planned out. So it's not necessarily that's a plan, but I feel like there's been a problem with some of the narrative goals and sort of almost like just character goals of, like, you know, for Mando season 1 and season 2, it was just like, I understand what these characters want and what they're aiming to do, and they hit obstacles, and, you know, they're like, what's unfolding. But for a you know, one of the timeline portions of Book of Boba Fett, and for a lot of Mando season 3, it's just like, I don't even know what these people want. Like, what are they trying to do? And, you know, I don't know if that is, you know, an attempt to sort of bob and weave and, like, undermine expectations or get people guessing about what's going to happen. I don't know if it's an actual, like, sort of treading water of they're trying to figure it out as they're working on it, or if, and this is also branching into internet speculation that's probably, you know, unclear how founded or healthy it is, that it's changes that get made in the process because it's like, oh, you know, here's our reaction to focus group messaging, or, you know what, now we're going to do a movie down the road, so, like, don't do this here now, like, we're going to do it later in some other show or in a movie. And so, you know, that maybe there were things that were going to happen this go around that got moved and you know, or and then replaced with sort of stuff that didn't really connect and felt like a lot of treading water. My version of the jetpack, the Chekhov's jetpack, of like, what exactly is supposed to be happening here, which again wasn't my observation. This is one of my buddies noted it first, was how many times this season the same bit of exposition was repeated through an episode. Where it was just sort of like, we're going to explain this, but we're really going to explain this. And that didn't really come to anything. The sort of standout for me is the episode where we first see the jetpacks only don't go so far. The child's been taken, is up in a nest. They're like, there's like 3 times that they're like, we cannot use a jetpack because if it makes too much noise, it's going to wake up the mother and the mother's going to come and attack us. It's like, they say that before they leave. They say that on the plane. They say that at the base of the mountain. And then no one uses a jetpack and it doesn't wake up the mother and it's not a big deal. And so it's like, what are we doing? Is that like, is that an issue of editing after the fact? Is that just like a weird sort of storytelling stumble? But, it felt like a little micro example of the issues with the season, of like the pieces not fitting together in a way that like made sense. I mean, there's parts of it that I loved and I had a great time, but it definitely felt the shakiest after 2 seasons that seemed to have a pretty clear, like, this guy is going to commit to Baby Yoda, the child, Grogu, and that's the first season, is like, I'm going to be the guardian of this, and then we have to get him to his people. We have to get to a Jedi. That's the second season. Like, what was the goal of this season? I guess it was Mandalorians come together, but that never felt like, they didn't really feel like that's what was happening until it was just like, oh yeah, Mandalorians, we're together now, at the end. So yeah, it's interesting how shaky things are getting.
There's so many different things I could pick up on and continue. I think, let me start with just my general thoughts on the season as it applies to some of what you said. So for me, I'm kind of 2 minds of the season, because on the one hand, I really loved the broader story that we got of going back to Mandalore. As someone who really loves the Clone Wars, the Mandalore arcs are among my all-time favorites. Those are the ones that I remember the most, even years after having seen them. And so to me, I was really excited about the prospect of, expanding the world of the show, The Mandalorian. And I do agree that, like, I think largely a lot of the issues with the pacing and the structuring and the people being uncertain where the season was going, I think that's probably largely a byproduct of them trying to expand and not really knowing quite how, knowing that they wanted to, and knowing that with this other movie that we're working towards that they have to, but at the same time, like, it's going out of their comfort zone, right? So it makes sense that the things that would have been firing on all cylinders with, like, oh, this is a lone wolf and cub story about a Mandalorian and the child, and like, like that cornerstone. I think a big complaint people had of this season was that just got lost for many episodes at a time, right? That wasn't the main attraction of this season. But on the other hand, like, I really love Bo-Katan's story. I love her arc, and I love the idea of different Mandalorians coming together. On the one hand, I like that they did that, but on the other hand, as a fan who knows a lot more about the backstory of Mandalore, mostly from the Clone Wars, I feel like they didn't actually do enough to satisfy me. Like, I think they got caught in the middle where they were like, well, we can't mention Duchess Satine because no one knows who she is unless you've seen the Clone Wars, right? But then I felt that for me, that made it feel like a lot went unsaid with Bo-Katan, right? Like, where, like, I'm like, well, how would she go, like, talk about her relationship with Mandalore and never mention Duchess Satine? That makes no sense. Or that just seems like a missed opportunity. And I feel like they didn't trust the audience enough, because I feel like in past seasons, I'm thinking in particular, well, actually, I'm thinking of the Book of Boba Fett, which I keep thinking is the Mandalorian. But the scene where Paz Vizsla fights Din Djarin with the Darksaber, we get a pretty big exposition nugget from the armorer about, like, and she's telling us things that we would have seen or would know about from the Clone Wars, and in a way that I thought was, like, pretty accessible for someone who hadn't seen that. But I feel like we just didn't get any of those moments in this season, where they just kind of skipped over all that, and they were like, and that to me actually felt like a very Marvel thing, where it's like a lot of people who are deep in the comics are bringing something to it, but it's not visible to people who are watching who don't have that context. And so that to me is kind of like, that combined with feeling like we over speculated when the answer was simple all along about in terms of where the finale was going, right? Because there was all this discussion about who was the spy, and like, and it really brought me back to season finales of certain Marvel series where it's like, oh, we created this whole meta narrative with the X-Men with WandaVision, and it turned out it was just a normal guy, right? Like it didn't amount to anything. And like, yes, that is on us as fans for like overhyping things and kind of getting too excited. But at the same time, I feel like with Marvel series, Disney Plus series in particular, a repeated criticism has been, oh, the simplest outcome or the most obvious outcome was what happened. And I feel like that's sort of what happened this season as well.
I think that I agree with that. Makes sense. I will say I think it's easy to get locked in on like we were all worried about like the spies, but I think that like the show certainly invited it with the episode title The Spies, but even like the lead up to this season, you know, it did feel like it was setting up a story where it was almost going to be like a triangle of the armorer as the sort of religious zealot, Bo-Katan as the sort of power-hungry exiled leader, and then Din as the sort of, you know, his own kind of person figuring things out. And I like the idea of, but actually the season is the three, you know, those different types of people, those different like sections, factions need to work together and actually unite. But then like there wasn't really a lot of conflict between them during the course of the season. And you know, I will say at this point, I don't know what I'm supposed to think about the Children of the Watch as a sort of fundamentalist extremist group. It really felt like you know, with season 2 and especially with, you know, the season 2.5 parts of the Book of Boba Fett, where it was just like, yo, like, do not trust the armorer, do not trust this, like these are extremists. Din, you got to get out. Pedro, we got to see your face, like we need to do this. But like it feels like this season has been a little bit of just sort of like, you know, can't we all just get along, and like what if we all, you know, we can all just be Mando in our own way, and we did. But like it is interesting, and I think maybe this is a thematic thing more than a narrative thing, but you know, it feels like there's these threads or elements that are set up and then sort of left to dangle, which I don't know, and maybe this is also me bringing too much real world stuff into it, but the like, no, I think the like religious zealot extremists, like we just need to be nice to them and we just need to accept them and let them be part of things, and we're just all going to work together. It's fine. And also maybe democracy doesn't work. It's like, wait a minute, like Jon Favreau, what's happening? Like this is you know, so it is an issue of like fans like churning and coming up with theories. I was 100% in on the armorer was a spy because I was like, oh, like she's been working for Gideon all along. That explains her inconsistent character. But it turns out she just has an inconsistent character, and that's it. So you know, it's partly on us for doing that. It's also, I think, a degree on the show for not having the clarity of you know, both sort of setting things up and then closing it off in a way that will resolve any such speculation.
To pick up that thread, and then in the show notes, we are looking forward to Ahsoka and onward. So I will say a lot of what you're both saying makes me very nervous for Ahsoka. So the first is, to PT's point, they have to have a really strong vision for this, and it has to be something really specific. And then to pick up what Jen was saying, I think they're going to get it from both sides. I mean, my personal moment of that trailer was when Ahsoka says heir to the Empire, and every Star Wars nerd book nerd from the 90s freaked out and got so excited. And then it's like, but now you're demanding that we compare this to Heir to the Empire, and not just the literal text of Heir to the Empire, but what Heir to the Empire meant to us. And so I think that's danger. That's playing with fire, right? Of getting the fans hyped up in a certain direction to then go in a new direction, as it should go in a new direction. They shouldn't just adapt those books. And I think they're going to get it from the other side, because there's a lot of skepticism still about this Ahsoka. And is she the Ahsoka that means what Ahsoka meant to the 9-year-olds in 2008, right? Because that character has such heavy importance, and it's going to be really hard to please those fans. And so you've got the 90s fans pulling you one way. You've got the you know, the post prequel generation, because the Clone Wars generation is almost its own micro generation there. They're pulling you in an entirely different way, that Ahsoka better be the center of this. Never mind the Rebels generation that's suddenly like, what? We're involved again too? Like, this is awesome. And so I think it's really dangerous turf. And, you know, I said it the last time I was speaking, they have to teach us how to watch this. And they need to be very clear on what this show is or isn't, to both manage those expectations and to, you know, calm us down in a lot of ways.
And to add another faction to that, there's also the people who are like, I don't know anything about Ahsoka besides the fact she showed up in Mandalorian and
Right.
Book of Boba Fett. So like, I don't know who Sabine is. I don't know who Hera is. I don't even really know that she knows Anakin beyond the fact that she said it once to Luke. Like those people, the live action only people also exist. And that's going to be interesting to see if
and a lot of those folks are readers of the long take. I think I think a lot of positive feedback I've gotten on my reviews is sort of like the deepening and like sort of like the extra context and information that we can provide, having watched everything and read everything and knowing everything and been to the panels and like we've got the full experience. And so I think I often see my reviews and the role of my reviews as sort of like distilling all that. What's the need to know for this for a broader audience? And yeah, that's going to be really interesting to navigate for all the reasons you just said, in terms of there's so many canon plates spinning in the show, that it's going to be hard to pick and choose what to explain. I feel like, but we'll have to see. So yeah, are there? How does the knowledge that we're headed towards an event film change, if at all, what you think is coming for the future series? Ahsoka, Skeleton Crew, I guess future seasons of The Mandalorian.
I mean, I was confident Thrawn was a major character in Ahsoka, but now that there's a movie, I don't know if that's true.
So you think we might get a delayed reveal of Thrawn? Yes. A lot of people thought Thrawn would show up at the end of Mandalorian season 3.
I mean, I would say, like, again, based on nothing that I've seen or read or any kind of a rumor, like if there were tinkering with the story of Mandalorian season 3 because of the development of like the meta development of the plans for the show, that could have been one of the things that changed. Was there, like, the initial draft when they were going into filming season 3 had Thrawn showing up at some point, and then that got like, no, wait, we got to save this because we're building towards blah blah blah. That's my speculation.
And I mean, reports are that this movie is probably 5 to 6 years out. So I think to think of it all as a slow burn, and the moment in the Spies episode where it's like, well, where is Thrawn? And Paleon's like, he's coming. Like, no idea. I think it is going to be a really slow build. I maybe prove me wrong, Star Wars, but I bet that little shot of Ezra in the hologram is maybe all we see of Ezra, even, which prior to some of this, I would have said we'd get there much faster. Now, I was entirely wrong. I mean, I said all of season 3 and Mandalore would be the quest, and that was wrapped up in 2 episodes. So maybe they will, surprise me again. But I can't pretend like, oh, well, now I'll watch it all, because before I wasn't going to. Of course I was going to watch it all, but I think I worry about it putting a set of expectations on Skeleton Crew in particular, because that seemed like it was going to be best as understood as a fun little side project, and now it's like, no, this is woven in and these characters matter, and again, I don't know enough about what goes on in Lucasfilm. Maybe that's how it was always conceived, but now I'm rolling into that saying, what are the pieces that contribute to the Mandoverse, instead of let's enjoy these kids and Jude Law is maybe a Force user, let's do it. So I think it's going to be tough to think of anything as superfluous, which I would again say is the problem with Marvel right now. Like, hey, Ms. Marvel is just fun and it's about high schoolers, let's have a laugh. No, like, you have to take this seriously. You have to track the objects in the book. And so I think it's going to be a weird moment in fandom if they don't get that exactly right.
I feel like at minimum, Skeleton Crew, its own season is going to be its own thing, but then sort of like in an Avengers Assemble style moment, they like show up to help, right? Like apropos of like almost nothing, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's very possible, that it's just kind of like that they have their own story they're dealing with in their own show, but then they kind of towards the end maybe stumble into the larger conflict and then end up getting involved in the other stories. So I can definitely see that happening, but I agree that, like, I originally when we heard about that show at the last year's celebration, it definitely seemed like its own thing, because it's sort of also targeted at a different demographic. Like, it seemed like they were pitching it like to younger audiences potentially, and that it wasn't going to be as serious, right? Or but now who knows? PT, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say that, to harken back to something Greg said a little while ago, which was, these shows have to teach us how to watch them. That I'm pretty bullish on the Book of Boba Fett, as like I liked it, I think, more than a lot of other people did. I do think I do have like one suggestion of like this would fix a bunch of the narrative issues. I don't know why Boba Fett wanted to become the crime boss, and it's not made clear. And that's the core issue, I think. But one of the sort of how do we watch these shows was that there was like something that clearly felt like episode 1 season 3 of the Mandalorian was kind of jammed in there, and I was a defender of that because I was like, oh well, this is just how these movies are going to work. Sorry, these shows, the Mandoverse shows, are going to they're teaching us that like these are going to interconnect to the degree that we will get basically episodes of another show in this. And when we got the Dr. Pershing episode in Mando season 3, it was like, yes, like this is like another show that we're getting like a half-hour episode of in the middle. Like this is all going to start to make sense. And then it like that didn't really get picked up on again, and it didn't really make sense. And I'm like, wait, maybe I'm giving them too much credit. I'm giving Jon Favreau too much credit for having like this sort of high-minded idea of we're going to the Ahsoka series is going to have an episode that is like kind of focused on Boba Fett because like that's what we're doing. And maybe Skeleton Crew has an episode where someone comes in, and I don't know if that's true anymore. I think it was just we only have so much material for Book of Boba Fett. We have too much material for Mando season 3. You've got Mando in my Boba Fett. Like that's how it ended up working out. So yeah, and the only other thing I will say on this thread is I wish they just hadn't included Skeleton Crew in the discussion of like, and the movie's going to be the culmination of blah. I'd rather it have been a surprise that like Skeleton Crew, it's another show. It's taking place at the same time. But now it is burdening it with the expectation of, even if it is like Mandalorian season 1 of like, it's its own thing in its own corner. No one's really paying attention to it, or it's not connected with anything else. Everyone's just like, when are we getting to the fireworks factory of Din and Grogu showing up, or Ahsoka popping in? Like there's going to be, every week will be the like, is this the week when it's just like, just let it be its own thing and grow. So yeah, I think that may have been a disservice to.
And again, that's
show.
a problem that Marvel shows have had, right? Because She-Hulk very explicitly actually in the show kind of made fun of fans to be like, we know you want Daredevil, like we know that's what you're here for, we don't like it, but we know, like, and kind of playing with the idea of like, oh, is this going to be the episode that has Daredevil in it, right? So yeah, it's like the more I think about it, the more parallels I see in the storytelling. But if you go back to early Marvel, I think the beauty of those early phases was that the individual pieces were largely unconcerned with plugging into the larger story, but they did incrementally, bit by bit. Like there'd be little, like the stinger, right, or like the end credit scene for one of them would have something that maybe would get picked up later, or like a future movie would take something that seemed small in one of the earlier movies and then kind of like expand it. So, but that was never at the expense of the story that we're getting in the moment. And so that's my worry, is that like that we're trying to do a Marvel thing, but it's later Marvel rather than earlier. Like we're trying to fast forward to Endgame too quickly, basically, as opposed to letting it build. But maybe, like Greg said, it's going to be 5 years probably until we get the Dave Filoni movie. So maybe that will be enough time to sort of do it right.
One last thing I want to note is Jen and I went to the Paley Fest panel. I think we may have that might have been mentioned at some point. I don't know why in another episode we did. But we went to this Paley Fest panel that had Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni and Rick. I always mispronounce his last name, Famuyiwa. Am I saying that right? Okay, I got some nods. And then Pedro Pascal and Katie Sackhoff. And it was interesting because that was like the Friday before like the week before Celebration in London. So they hadn't made any of these announcements yet. And I will say this in the context of, it was very clear that Jon Favreau was enjoying poking Dave Filoni about like, oh, like this could be a spoiler, like saying things that like you could tell made Dave Filoni nervous. And Filoni talked about how he's just like, I can't say anything, I'm not allowed to, like I'm giving you answers that don't have any content, but I'm pretending there's content, and you agree as if I've said anything to you when I've said nothing, and we just have to keep doing this, which was very funny. But like in that panel, Jon Favreau was just sort of like, I want to do this as long as they'll let me. Like basically he's like, I want to keep doing this. We have plans. It made it sound like he had plans for like years and years out. Like they've already written season 4, and that like we're ready to just go and keep going with this. And that felt like an interesting contrast to, there is an endpoint that Dave is responsible for. And I don't want to be like, YouTube thumbnails with just red eyes on both Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni, where it's just like, fight between Favreau and Filoni. But it's like, I wondered like what is the sort of thing, is there a possibility they're going to do this movie and then it's like, and Mandalorian season 7's coming out like in 18 months, or is it just going to be like, no, this is the end of that chapter and we wrap it up? Or is it more like the first Avengers movie or Endgame, where it's like we end this whole sequence, but then it's like we're going to return to your favorite characters already in progress, like telling more stories? I don't know, it'd be interesting.
All right.
Time will tell, I guess, is the only way to react to that. I mean, it is interesting. I like the point. Marvel almost works better when it pulls from what's already come into the future. And I think you're right that at this moment they're projecting us forward so much. It feels much more like late Marvel. And but I also just want to put the last point in, which is, but if you don't like any of that, you have Andor, you have Acolyte, you have endless books and comics, you have James Mann. So the good thing is, I think that they have so many options for fans that, the Blast Points podcast always talks about the beautiful Star Wars buffet, and you can go grab whatever you want and fill up your plate, and there's plenty of it. And I think that, to me, more than anything, gives me comfort and optimism, because if something's not working for me, I will not go on the internet and make 20 videos about how terrible it is. I will just move on and eat the other thing at the buffet. I'm quite skilled at buffets, and I will enjoy applying those skills here.
Also, shout out the Bad Batch, which we got one more season of that coming, and that's incredible.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and all of this sort of speculation and concern is not necessarily to say that like we're complaining about what we're getting. It's quite the opposite. It's like, what a time to be a Star Wars fan. And like, we're so lucky. We're so incredibly lucky to be getting all of this content. It's just interesting to think about how the franchise sort of continues to evolve and grow and expand. All right. So to wrap up, because I know we've been going for quite some time now, we're approaching the 2-hour mark, which I know, if you're still listening, thank you, just for sticking with us. You must really like Star Wars. And so since we are always with one eye on the Oscars, I just wanted to. There's not a whole lot to talk about here, but I did want to kind of acknowledge that's this history of Star Wars and the Oscars, and sort of again end with like some light speculation. So A New Hope actually won several Oscars: art direction, which I think now would be production design, costume design, editing, score, sound, and visual effects. And then it was actually nominated for a bunch of above the line categories: Best Picture, Director, I think Screenplay, and then that's sort of like it all went downhill from there in terms of Oscar wins, because Empire only won sound, which again, because citing our earlier conversation about how Empire, we like many people agree that Empire is the best film of the original trilogy. So the fact that A New Hope cleaned up at the Oscars and then Empire came away with just one win seems a little wrong. And then Return of the Jedi won absolutely nothing. Sequels and prequels have gotten some nominations, but only for craft categories, sort of like visual effects and score. And so my question kind of is like, will there ever be a time when Star Wars films can be Oscar contenders again?
No, Thank you and good night. I'm gonna put my hopes on Andor for Emmys. I think the Academy has moved on from Star Wars. Boy, do they want to hawk you some Star Wars merchandise to help pay for their museum, but I don't think they're ever gonna honor Star Wars again. Maybe the exception being if there is somehow some kind of incredible acting performance. A la, the odd one that gets nominated in a Marvel movie, but they also don't win. Sorry. So I think that's about all we can hope for.
Yeah, I mean, this is a terrible thing to say, but I'll say it anyway. It might have to be a Heath Ledger style, like real life tragedy, where it's just like, if is there some way that they're like, we have to honor this person? But
don't put in the universe, PJ.
I know that was I said it was a bad thing to say, but I mean, there was like, and this was more fandom than in any sort of reality, but there was the sort of like, Harrison Ford, could he get a Best Supporting Actor for The Force Awakens, or Mark Hamill for The Last Jedi? And obviously those things didn't happen. What I will say is I also was looking up the sort of Oscar history. I was like, oh, maybe I'll surprise you guys with a little quiz, but I didn't put anything about it in the Google Doc, and then Jen actually put all the answers. So I was like, okay. But both all three of the original trilogy movies won non-competitive Oscars as well, which I was kind of confused as to what that meant, but they all got special achievement Academy Awards, and I looked up what those were, and it seems like they are technical craft categories that can exist, but at the time in the 70s and 80s and through like the early 90s, there was like a special committee that would do the nominations, which is a slightly different than the way the branches handle it now. Like I think now they have it where it's like there's a short list that like has to be a certain amount of movies, but back in the day it was like there was a committee, and basically if the committee was like, there's only one movie that could get this award, so we're just going to give it, like we're not even going to like have it be a competitive category, we're just giving it. And so it was sound effects, which went to Ben Burt for Star Wars. That was like the droid sounds, the alien sounds, and all the blasters and lightsabers and everything. They were just like, no, here, like we're not doing a competitive category this year. You just win. And then for Empire and Jedi, it was visual effects. So those are categories that exist and could have been competitive, but like it was basically like, you're so good, like we're not doing that. And so every all but one movie since then, Star Wars movie, has been nominated for visual effects. Do you guys know which movie did not get nominated for visual effects? Live action. The Clone Wars didn't get nominated for anything. It didn't even get Best Animated Movie. So not that one, but yeah,
I'm gonna guess Rise of Skywalker.
okay.
Which is what I should know because I was definitely paying close attention to the Oscars then, but I feel like I'm feeling good about that.
Okay. Jen?
I feel like it's going to be something weird. Like Solo, a Star Wars story.
So yeah, I think these are both great answers, and I think I would have said either of those, even though those were both nominated. It was Revenge of the Sith. Revenge of the Sith didn't get nominated for visual effects, which I think speaks to the like prequel burnout of just like people just being like, no, like, yeah, sure, he's doing all this stuff, I don't know. And they just didn't, like, just the disrespect. It only got, I think it got makeup. Like it got only one nomination, and I think it was for makeup. So all that to be said, I think that a future Star Wars movie could win visual effects, but that's it. And maybe it could be a sound, it could be a sound design. If somehow at the age of like 96, John Williams comes back to do the new Jedi Order, like soft episode 10 score, maybe they're like, look, we got to give him another Oscar. Like, but I think they're just a craft category thing now, unless barring something absolutely insane. But I mean, I would contend The Last Jedi was absolutely insane and should have like gotten a lot more attention. So, could there be a movie that many degrees better than The Last Jedi that comes out in the Star Wars world that takes the Academy by storm? I would love to see it, but I don't. I think visual effects is the cap.
Yeah. And I think you're right that like Star Wars is like too big now. I think that's part of it, right? Because like to explain its earlier wins for the original trilogy, I feel like it was so new and no one had ever seen anything like it before, and then therefore it kind of cleaned up. But now it's just so staple in our entertainment lives that like it's business as usual and not gonna get any attention.
And it's also Disney now, right? I don't think that's not just a YouTuber point on this one. That, you know, it's another part of this behemoth studio that owns everything as opposed to its own unique thing.
All right. Well, this was, to borrow Greg's phrase, a buffet of a podcast. So much good stuff. Thank you both so much. Greg, where can folks find you on the internet?
Thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be on Long Take. I have already begun my binge of Wes Anderson movies, preparing for my next appearance, unless Mission Impossible tapes first. But and apologies to both of you. My costume bit turned into a slow motion striptease as I got hot and uncomfortable over the last 2 hours. So people can find me not doing that on the internet. Anywhere on social media, I'm Ion Cannon, EYEONCANON. I do not have a cosplay OnlyFans yet at this point, but I will make that announcement here when the time comes.
Greg, this is a family show. What are you doing?
The more papers you grade at the end of the semester, I think the more that's going to look like an appealing alternative.
That's a better career, yeah.
And PT, where can people find you?
You can barely find me on Instagram and Letterboxd at PT McNiff, PTMCNIFF.
And you can find me at Subchakchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI on Instagram, and Qui-Gon Jinn on Letterboxd. And again, thank you both. Happy Star Wars Day. May the Force be with you. Thank you for listening. You can follow The Long Take on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive reviews of films with Oscar buzz, as well as new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.